All right, so we want to welcome everyone to another Congress conversation. We're glad that you have taken out time to be a part of hearing the dynamic panel that we have that will be sharing thoughts on our topic tonight. Our topic tonight is really around mental health and the church. In particular, how do we as an African American community best be able to utilize the options that we have in our community and the resources that we have around mental health, but also how the church can best be able to partner with and work with those who are mental health professionals, not only in our churches, but also outside of our churches. So I am going to open with a quick word of prayer, and then I am going to take a couple of minutes to introduce those who are going to be part of our panel tonight, and then we're just going to hop into our conversation. Won't you pray with me? Father, we thank you for all that you are. We thank you for this day and the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, whether we are participating by asking or answering questions or simply participating by hearing what will be shared. Father, our prayer is that your spirit would direct this conversation, that you would lead us, that you would guide us in everything that we need to know and to understand. For God, we know that our understanding comes from you. So God, we pray that your spirit would do just that. Grant us understanding even now. We thank you for these wonderful young ladies who have agreed to be a part of this conversation. And we ask that the insight that they would share will be received with open hearts and willing spirits. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Again, welcome to everyone who is a part tonight. We are certainly glad to have you on tonight. We have four wonderful young ladies who are going to be helping us to navigate through the conversation that we're going to be having tonight. The first person that we have is Miss Valerie Jones. Valerie Jones is a licensed professional counselor with over 10 years of experience counseling, community outreach, and in advocacy. She received a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Chicago State University and a Master's of Arts in Marriage and Family Counseling from Governor State University. And we are glad to have her on and a part tonight. Valerie, you just want to raise your hand or wave your hand real quick so everybody see who you are. Everybody see her? All right. Sounds good. Next we have Miss Raquel D. Did I say it right, Raquel? I messed it up earlier. I said it right? I didn't.
Raquel, no, you're good. Raquel
Okay.
Dubose. Yes.
Raquel DuBose. Oh,
yes.
Sorry. I saw something else on here. I'm just tripping. Raquel DuBose is a native of Cincinnati, Ohio. She attained her Bachelor's of Arts degree in International and Development Studies from Ohio State University.
Wait. Now, real.
Ohio State University. I'm sorry.
Appreciate
I grew up a Michigan fan, so it was hard for me to even say those words. In 2006, she also graduated from the University of Dayton with a Master's of Science in Education in Counselor Education with a focus in clinical mental health counseling in 2012. Raquel is a licensed professional clinical counselor with supervisory designation for the state of Ohio, and we are glad to have her on and a part of our conversation tonight. The final panelist, if you will, that we have is Miss Melissa Taylor. She is a licensed social worker. She is a proud alumnus of Clark Atlanta University with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, the National Louis University with a Master's of Arts in Psychology, and that's in Chicago, Illinois. And then the National Louis University with a postgraduate certification in community counseling. She's a licensed professional counselor with the state of Illinois, and she has several certifications, too many for me to be able to list off on here, but we're certainly glad to have her on. Thank you so much for being a part, Melissa. And last but not least, we do have I'm gonna call her the co-moderator, even though she's more of the brain trust behind all of this, and that is Ms. Kyla Gordon. Kyla has over 9 years experience in clinical mental health, providing therapy and case management for children and adults throughout the Chicago area. She currently serves as the clinical coach at ComSite Corporation, the world's largest provider for employee assistance programs, integrating behavioral health, wellness, and absence management services. She has trained over 300 intake clinicians in EAP and managed care services, and supervises intake clinicians as they provide supportive services and crisis stabilization for at-risk clients. As the clinical coach, Kyla is also responsible for providing feedback while encouraging clinicians to utilize critical thinking and problem solving to quickly resolve their issues. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in communications with an emphasis in media production and a minor in music technology from the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. So we are glad to have Kyla on as a part of the conversation tonight as well. So we do welcome these wonderful ladies who will be carrying the heaviest load tonight of talking through a topic that is not only heavy, but in some ways can be somewhat taboo, somewhat confusing for those who are believers and a part of the church. And so our goal tonight is honestly to be able to provide relevant information and understanding, to be able to answer and clear up some of the questions that may be out there, while also being able to provide understanding for some of the resources that may be available that we as a church community, or even just we as an African American community, may not be aware of. So with that, Kyla, if you would get us kicked off by kind of giving us our opening topic or direction, and we'll get going tonight.
Right. Hello, everyone. So my the first question is, mental health is the huge elephant in the room in the church. We are taught to ignore or pray for people that are different than us, and we rarely talk about therapy as a tool of encouragement. So how can we do our part in destigmatizing mental health amongst believers? Anyone can go.
So I think conversations like this is the best way to do it, and also basically normalizing it in whatever way possible, connecting it to just like your overall self, and not thinking that it's a disorder or it's a weakness. So kind of like empower people to be more aware of their mental health and how it will benefit them, even in a spiritual way, a religious way. So making more of just having more opportunities for these conversations to get people comfortable with discussing their anxiety or their depression or their trauma. So
I was gonna say, I think that a big part of it, hopefully y'all can hear me because I'm in the sunroom and there's fans because it's warm. And so I think that an important piece of that is to make sure that folks understand that that you can have mental health difficulties. Believe both can be true. I think sometimes it's either or for some folks. Either you believe in God and you believe that He's going to be able to do all the things you need Him to do, or you believe that mental health therapy or whatever the intervention may be is going to be helpful. I think that integrating both of those is a good start, because we can do both. We can do both.
Sorry, interject. I'm sorry. Whomever has their phone vibrating, can you please turn it on silent, because it's disrupting the flow. Thank you. Go ahead, Melissa.
That may be my phone. I'm sorry.
Okay, girl.
So I think also to understand that mental health is not just an elephant in the room in church, but it is also still an elephant in the room or in our community as African Americans. There's still negative stigmas to those who have mental health issues. And there's really, for a lot of people, they don't feel like it's a safe place to discuss either their symptoms or either, just what they're dealing with on a continual basis. And so I think part of what we can do is first of all recognize that mental health does exist, and then also really understand just some of the facts of how it does impact our community. If you don't have the facts, if you don't have the knowledge, you're not really able to help if you don't know. So I think it's good to also know that as well. For our community, we are more likely to maybe talk to a provider about mental health, but we are least likely to get treatment. And that's for a number of reasons. So that's always a good thing. It's always good for us to know just the facts of where we are as a community.
I know oftentimes we're told to just suck it up, or our problems or issues are minimized. Why do you guys think we are just taught to just like push through?
Because we're Black people.
Bottom line, we can't show weakness.
As Black people,
weakness.
Yeah, as Black people, we pride ourselves on being able to persevere and push through. And yeah, that was serious, and yeah, that's a big deal, but we don't have time for that. We all have to deal with racism, oppression. We have to deal with stuff on the job. We got to deal with our families. We don't have time for all this other stuff. And so I think that I think that strength can be misconstrued as ignoring things. So it's like, again, both can be true. You can be strong. You can be a strong person. You can have strong will, strong faith, and also still, invite folks who have been trained to do so to help you move through some of those mental health challenges. So I think the struggle is, that's just how we were raised. It's like, we Black, we done been through this 10 times over, 100 times over. We can do this. You'll be fine. Pray, talk to your pastor, talk to your spouse.
And I also believe, like, because we have that resilient spirit, it comes very natural for us to continue on because we know that we have the strength to do so. And it's just a part of knowing, or just encouraging people to know that there's strength in seeking support from others. It takes strength to say, hey, I need some help, or hey, I know I can get through this, but I probably need somebody to walk alongside of me that has a different viewpoint. So I think that's where it just needs to be a push, because again, it's automatic and we don't want to be seen as weak. So we have to reframe seeking support as a strength, to know that, hey, we have this out there and I'm capable of accessing or figuring out a way. I'm resourceful enough to find my supports.
Kyla, can you repeat that question again? I'm sorry.
I know that we were taught to just like pray things away. And why is that? Like, why are we taught to just like pray it away, or just push through?
Well, I think some of that has to deal with just the trauma we have had in history as African Americans. And so there was really no place for us to talk, if just dealing with our history. So, when we were enslaved, we were traumatized all the time. And part of that was so that you would not speak out, you would not say anything. And so all of those traumas we've internalized, and we've learned over the years the resiliency, but we've just learned that that's a learned behavior for us of how to just kind of get through. We just don't say anything. And the one place that we were able to convene was church. But even now in our society, we have it's difficult for some people to feel comfortable for whatever reasons that we have formulated as what's acceptable to talk about and what's not acceptable. And again, that's all just learned behavior through our history.
I kind of want to, this is Crystal. Hi, everybody. I kind of want to piggyback on the pray things away. When I was listening to what you guys were saying, I think historically, a lot of mental health issues weren't attributed to mental health, but I think they were more attributed to maybe the devil has something on them. Or they thought it was some type of spiritual warfare that was going on with somebody, or they thought it was a behavioral problem. A child or an adult could be having some type of problem. They probably thought maybe they didn't get enough whoopings as a kid. Historically, we had a lot of private ways of dealing with ourselves. A lot of households were like, don't put my business out in the street. You know, you keep that in the family, you keep that in the house. You don't go out there and tell everybody what's going on. So I think a bunch of those issues, a bunch of the ways that we dealt with it just carried on from generation to generation. We were, you know, it was almost like we were being praised to survive and be a martyr for our problems, or, you know, or we had to deal with it within ourselves because we didn't have anybody to talk to. Or like I said before, it was a spiritual thing and people just thought that either, you know, you probably wasn't saved enough, reason why you were acting the way you were acting and things like that. So it's just a culmination of why Black people as a whole have to just suffer in silence.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Crystal. I really do appreciate it. One thing I want to ask us to do is keep in mind that we do have a panel that we've asked to share and respond to the questions that we have. We do want to be able to talk through and acknowledge any questions that you do have. If you have those, please utilize the chat feature. If you look at the bottom of the screen, if you click on the chat feature, I am monitoring that and we will try to address those there. But we're asking that only the moderators and the panelists come off mute and comment, please. Thank you.
Thanks, cuz. Appreciate that. That was my cousin. Shout out to Crystal. I know we're talking about trauma, so we talked about, Melissa, you brought up a good point of the trauma that we've experienced has gone like decades and years and years and years. So kind of going into the current, more specifically, just with all of the social injustice and the health issues that are currently going on here and around the world, what are some symptoms that you guys have noticed from the clients you all have encountered, if any?
Currently in my role now, I'm really working with those who have been affected by the coronavirus in my full-time job at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois. But in my years of experience of being a therapist working with the Department of Children and Family Services, and working not just with the children, but also working with the parents and doing family, how you saw trauma in a lot of ways was that a lot of it was generational. You would see, for example, because some of it may have been the learned behavior. A case that I had specifically that comes to mind was a child who was sexually molested by a mother's boyfriend. And that mother herself was also molested by her mother's boyfriend. And so sometimes trauma can be something that is passed, from generation to generation. And so you'll see it in that way. And a lot of times, because we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to be shamed about it, then we don't say anything. And the child that I was working with, constantly was denying that anything happened to her. And it was just something that I just felt like, no, there's something else going on. And once we were able to really sit with the family in a safe environment, were we able to see that this has been something that's been passed down for generation. Each generation had someone that was molested in that case. But in terms of how you'll see it in trauma, in terms of our history, I'll just, self-disclose for myself. Even what we've been seeing now in our country with the civil unrest, with everything going on with George Floyd, systemic racism, police brutality. For me, there was one scene where you saw the police rushing on the people and tear gassing. And for me, that was a flashback when I was in college to when the Rodney King situation happened, and we were protesting peacefully at school, and the state of Georgia called in the state police, and they were on our campus with the guns and the tear gas during finals. And so I'm sure for someone else who may have seen what's going on, it may trauma for them back to if they were a part of SNCC or if they were a part of the protest in the 60s. And so you'll see different parts of how we can be re-traumatized due to what's going on in our society. And some of that is the fact that as a country, we have not totally addressed the issue of racism and how that does impact us. You know, the trauma is not just something that impacts us mentally, it impacts us emotionally, it impacts us socially, it can impact us physically. So trauma can totally impact the total well-being of a person or decline of a person's well-being.
Sounds good.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I think specifically as it relates to coronavirus. So I work with the criminal justice system, and so the ways that things have changed in the jails, as far as precautions, and folks having to be in certain things, when it comes to where they have to go and quarantine and all those sorts of things, that's been very different. I think the number one thing I've been seeing is anxiety. A lot of anxiety, a lot of excessive worry, a lot of irritability, a lot of restlessness, disrupted sleep for a lot of folks, because routines have been disrupted. And so I'm also covering for another department, which is recovery group for women. And so the women didn't have group for like 2 months, and they were struggling. A lot of them relapsed, and all those things, and not having that routine of going to group every day and seeing their sober friends, sober network, like all of those things definitely impacted the flow of their routine when it comes to recovery. So I think anxiety is the number one thing, and then how that affects people with regard to where they are in their recovery as well. That's probably been the top thing that I've been seeing specifically.
And for myself, I saw, because I work in community outreach, and so of course our clients were used to us going into their homes and like really checking on them, whether it was educating them about their medications, physical appointments with their doctors. So we did see a lot of our clients decompensate. We actually had several deaths. So like us knowing that our clients will isolate on a normal basis, this is like more isolation for them, more irritability, like you said, more aggressive behaviors that they normally wouldn't display in these times. And just that whole fearfulness that if I go outside, something's going to happen. Or just being paranoid about the fact that maybe they caused the coronavirus, and just different things that kind of come up with either the unrest, the civil unrest that's going on. Our communities in Chicago was looted, so that impacted them as well, because that anxiety increased because they were barely getting resources before, and then a lot of the places where they got resources were destroyed. So that's how I see it. The trauma, I see it in a lot of like different behaviors, and of course, call it intergenerational trauma.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's embedded in our DNA, and that is how we end up reacting and dealing with these learned behaviors. And some of them, I feel like it's like subconscious, these behaviors. They don't fully understand why they're acting this way, what their response is. So that's when the education piece comes in, and we just get a better way of normalizing and having this conversation.
Great. So I have a quick question that has come from our chat room. Someone asked, my family member is dealing with depression. He does not trust easily and does not feel counseling will help him. How can I best support him in getting the help and resources that he will trust?
This is Melissa. First of all, thanks for that question because I have always been a firm believer that there are many people who are dealing with depression and either one are afraid to acknowledge it. And so one of the things is, first of all, to be a support to that person. Just being there to understand that I do understand that you may be dealing with depression. I feel like there are, just like you've probably heard the term functional alcoholics, where they drink, but they're functioning enough to go to work. I have always felt that there are functional depressives, people who deal with depression every day, but they're functional enough where they'll go to work, they will pay their bills. But when it comes to just dealing with life stressors or whatever things that are triggers for them, they have depression. They may not experience it in terms of all of the symptoms of depression. So I think, first of all, to acknowledge that they're dealing with it. And sometimes having a conversation, if you know someone that they trust that is in the mental health field, that they can just have like coffee with or just have a general conversation, because they're probably not comfortable with making an appointment, actually sit to go and see someone that they don't know. And for a lot of times, it's hard to build that therapeutic rapport with the client when they already have reservations. So it's probably good if you know of someone, or if there's someone, myself, anyone, you know, that is able to talk to that person, just to see how they are, because then they can better, especially someone in our field, can kind of see where they are in the process if they really have a lot of fears and stigma, which is a part of our community, due to just the lack of trust of the not only the mental health field, but the medical field as well. So I think that's part of it, is to try to find someone that they do feel comfortable with speaking about it. That would be my first thing.
I think that also making sure that, you know, just like you said, Miss Melissa, validating that it's awkward. I think being able to just tell someone like it's gonna be weird, you don't know this person, you know, just kind of validating that it's going to be a process. And it's definitely trial and error. It's just like if you have a doctor, you know, if you go to your physical health doctor and you don't like them, you can switch. It's the same with your therapist. If you don't vibe with your therapist, you meet with a person a couple times, you don't feel like things are going well, they don't really connect, they're not really, you know, making sure that they're hearing you, you can change it. I think sometimes people feel like they are stuck with like it's like a one and done, and that's
Mm-hmm.
not true. Like you can, it's trial and error for sure, because your mental health is just as important as your physical health. So you have to find the right person that's going to help you navigate through that. And I think that, you know, just like Melissa said, just create like lessening some of that pressure. Like if you just want to just meet with them one time, see how it goes. If you don't like it, you don't have to go back. You always have a choice. And because I think that folks think that they are locked into certain things. So I think that just, you know, acknowledging, you know, and even if it's like, you know, I've noticed, you know, that you're struggling with something and there is somebody that may be able to help. Let's talk about what that can look like. Let's look it up together. Let's look at, you know, if we can find their pictures, see what they look like. If you want a certain type of person, you want a black therapist, you want a black woman therapist, a black male therapist, you know, the process of it can be therapeutic as well, to just figure out what might work best. And even in all of that, if you get to the person and you don't like them, you can change it. Now that obviously, you know, that is not ideal, but you know, just give them the freedom to be able to, like, this is your mental health and it's important to make sure you have the right fit.
And as a resource, you can go to psychologytoday.com. And that you're able to search for clinicians, you're able to search upon ethnicity. You can even search for clinicians based upon your insurance. That way you can cross-reference, you can read blurbs about those providers in your area as well. So that's definitely a good resource if you're interested.
Do your research. I mean, that's, be curious. Like, folks, all the information about most therapists in most states, as far as I know, is public record.
Right.
If they have disciplinary action, you can see if you want a counselor versus social worker, marriage and family therapist, a psychologist, all those different types of avenues. Do your research. And if it's a person that you feel like is not going to do that on their own, and if you're in the position to be supportive, be supportive.
Also, it takes a lot of patience if you're that person just in the background that's seeing someone go through those issues or decompensate. It takes time for that person to just feel comfortable. So continue just extending yourself and just having a conversation with them, making them feel comfortable so that they can in turn perhaps want to seek therapy or want to seek that higher level of care.
But one thing I do want to say is that if a person is experiencing depression, you definitely want to make sure that they're safe. Let's start there, that they are safe. Because a lot of times people who are dealing with depression also have a sense of hopelessness, and they will also isolate. And it's in those moments that they isolate that they may not make the best decisions. And so you always want to also just, say, look, I'm here if you ever feel that you are not safe. And then these are people that you can call. You can always call 911 if you're in an environment where you don't feel safe. And that's where a therapist also will help to help that person develop coping skills. Because once a person says, I'm depressed, it's not like, oh, I'm depressed, I'm going to a therapist, I feel great now. It's a process. And so that therapist will help them build a rapport, and in addition to that, will help them develop a plan if they ever feel like they are not safe and what they can do.
Sounds great. So along those same lines, how does one best deal with, as I've seen a couple of times in the comments, the possibility of someone possibly being in a place where they need to speak to someone, maybe they're dealing with some level of depression or whatever that looks like, but obviously they're not accepting it. So they are in some state of denial or just feeling like they can deal with it through their own means. As the concerned party, the family member, friend, whatever I am, how do I best be able to have a conversation to encourage them to begin to have those conversations with someone else?
The best that I can see for that is to be present. Just acknowledge what they're going through, as said before, and offer that support, because recovery is a long process. And until they really are ready for that change or doing something different, the only thing that you really can do is be that support and that ear. But also make sure you, as their support, set boundaries too, because there's only so much that you can help with. And then another thing, because hopelessness can turn to suicidal thoughts. So another thing is just practicing, like, hey, do you feel safe? Because these are basic questions that anybody can ask in spite of like whatever their background is. Are you safe? Do you feel like harming yourself? Can you tell me at least one highlight of your day? Like very simple things that can kind of support them through it, and just figuring out what other coping strategies that they've used in the past. Like, okay, you might have been experiencing this last week, but when we talked and you read something or you went for a walk, that seemed to make you feel better. Is that something that we could do again? Can we go on a walk right now? Would that help you? Just kind of like not distracting them from it, but letting them know that they have other possibilities than kind of like just sitting with their depression.
Also, helping them recognize their triggers too, because sometimes something may trigger them into that depressive state. So sometimes, when you're having that conversation, like she was saying, what happened today, it could be something that triggered them. And then, as a therapist clinician, you're able to kind of work through that. But as that supportive person, you can kind of be able to say, is it possible that that may have triggered you? How were you before that? And so that's also a good thing too.
I know there was a Sister Latanya had a mention that we as a people are afraid to be labeled as crazy when we're dealing with bouts of depression. I think that's with any mental illness, if it's depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, like anything that's beyond the norm. We all just have some type of fear about just really being free, and we really just retract, and it's a really scary feeling to just not be free and to be trapped in that ball. Let's see. Next question. So I know we talked about symptoms of depression. What are some symptoms of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, nightmares is definitely one. Reliving, where a person may be rethinking about the trauma or reliving it. That's definitely other symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of those, it may also cause them to have difficulty with sleep as well. So those are just some of the ones that are post-traumatic.
I think that avoiding talking about it, avoiding people, places, things that remind you of their trauma, and then some things can also be linked to PTSD or trauma responses that folks wouldn't necessarily think that they would. So like anger outbursts, irritability, reckless behavior, and some of the disorders, especially with PTSD or anxiety related disorders, can overlap. So you can have low motivation with depression. You can have low motivation or diminished interest and participation in activities with PTSD. You can have irritability with, just general anxiety. You can have, reckless behavior with bipolar disorder. And so it's like a lot of those things intersect. But I think with PTSD specifically, it's more about, of course, it's about the trauma piece of that and how that is affecting you in your day to day. I think that also, I work with a lot of folks who automatically say they have PTSD because they have been traumatized, and that's not necessarily true, because it's about how it's affecting your occupational and social, and the definition of a disorder is impacting your day to day functioning. And so I have to, that psychoeducation piece of it is you've been through a lot. If it's not affecting your day to day currently, it doesn't mean you necessarily meet the criteria for PTSD, but that doesn't mean that your trauma doesn't affect you. It doesn't mean, not to dismiss or invalidate their experience. And so I've had folks, because I do evaluations for mental health court, which is a docket for mentally ill people. And I've had folks, have questions about their diagnosis because they've been misdiagnosed, because they've been, just had a laundry list of things from childhood into adulthood, and things haven't been updated. And so I think that because things can intersect, it can get confusing sometimes. But for PTSD specifically, it's about the trauma response. It's about reliving, like Ms. Melissa was saying, the flashbacks, the nightmares, intrusive memories. It's about, and even those things, like I said, persistent, like negative, like thoughts, like you can just not think that anything is going to get better. That hopelessness, again, that intersection with depression can also be in PTSD as well. So I think kind of getting that education, which the therapist can provide. I mean, Google is great, but we don't want folks, diagnosing themselves, because that happens a lot. And so everyone is bipolar, which they are not, but according to them, they're bipolar. So the education piece is very, I think, important, because you want to have it right. You want to make sure that you're getting the appropriate help that you need.
So thank you for kind of sharing that. We're seeing a couple of questions, and I am curious about this myself. As we're talking about things like PTSD and all those other indicators that there is a need to have conversations with a therapist, in you all's opinion as the panel, one question that came up is, should it be mandatory for church leaders to speak to therapists? And how can that be beneficial for, and I'm curious about this even as a pastor myself, how can it be beneficial for a pastor or other church leaders to spend time speaking to therapists?
I was really thinking about that question once you sent the question, and I think that will kind of build the trust for your members to maybe seek help from these therapists and mental health professionals, because you're connected with them better than they are, and then it's just like you build that relationship, even if it's offering some groups. Like if you connect with some therapists and they offer groups about depression and they offer groups about PTSD, that's one way for people to kind of get comfortable with that type of setting, and then offer the connection for it to be individual. Because sometimes being in a group setting, it allows for, for people to feel like they're not alone, and that can be a segue into more individualized therapy. But I think it would be good for faith-based leaders to connect with these with therapists, and it's also like there are therapists, faith-based therapists as well, so that could be an avenue that that can be explored too.
Um, I won't say that it should be mandatory. I do think it helps, um, because there's nothing wrong with therapy. Let's start there first. I think this idea that, oh, if I'm in therapy, then, no, there's nothing wrong with anybody outreaching and having therapy. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I do think therapy can help anyone. Secondly, there are, even if you as a pastor have your own reservations about seeing a therapist, I do feel like there's a number of different things NAMI offers, which is I think it's the National Association on Mental Illness. They offer what's like a first aid training to understand like just the basics of mental health, and that's offered to anybody. So that's one way. There is a number of different trainings on just understanding trauma just generally, or understanding depression or understanding anxiety that you can take, so that you just have the basics to better understand as a pastor when someone's coming to you, and then you can clearly see that, okay, this person is really having a difficult time, and I need to, because I'm talking to them and I understand, like with depression, they've already said they're not sleeping, they're having difficulty with eating, they're having difficulty with focus. And so I know just from having a general understanding of that they may need to see a therapist. So I would say there's also trainings out there as well.
And those trainings, just to clarify, are open to people who aren't necessarily clinicians, but pastors or other church leaders could be able to have those trainings as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And I do know that some of those organizations will do like group trainings where they'll come in to your group and actually do the training so that you and other church leaders can learn and understand about mental health.
Okay. So along those same lines, one of the questions that came out is, where is, or is there a line between, as believers, waiting on the Lord or trusting in God to give us all that we need and help us through every situation, and going to get help? Is there a line? And if there is, what does that look like?
Is there a line? So I guess my question is, are they saying that if someone has a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and is there a line where they just recognize that it's out of their hands? Is this like from a pastoral perspective, or
No, I'm not
is
sure.
it?
I read the question. I would assume that it may be more so at what point is it, okay, I've prayed, I've read my Bible, I've done all of that, I need to do something more than that? At what point, what does that look like? Or is there a point where it's okay, and people don't jump on me but when I say this, but prayer can only get you so far, or reading the Bible can only get you so far. Now I need to go and have a conversation with someone. Is there a line that's there?
I think it's different for everyone. Let me first say that. I don't know if there's a line, and I think that's because when we say things like that, in my mind, my line is different from your line. And so if you come to me and I don't know anything, then my line will be, look, you just pray about it. I'm done. You know, I told you. But so I think um, I think we need to have or begin to create an environment where it's not so much a line, but it's the fact that my arms are open and I'm here. And if I'm not able to help, I'm definitely going to support you to find help. Because that line is going to be different for everyone.
I think to make it simplistic, if it's impeding your ability to function,
Right.
then you should seek additional assistance. And I would never say to just like stop praying. Pray and do counseling, or pray and seek psychiatry if counseling isn't your jam. Like you have to pray in addition to. But if it's impeding your level of functioning, then that should be simplistically saying that should be the time when you try to seek additional care.
I think Miss Melissa saying that it's relative is very true, because every person, like sometimes it doesn't take a person to be level 10. I'm about to end it. This is it, for them to feel like they need help. Sometimes it is, but sometimes folks can be ready in those beginning stages of, okay, I really just feel like something's not right. I really need to talk this through with somebody. What's your suggestion? So I think it's different for every person, like Miss Melissa said. I think that it doesn't have to be level 10 for folks to get help. And that's another piece of it, I think. I think sometimes people think that it has to be, I can't deal with it, I'm in a ball, I'm not going to work, which is serious. And you should definitely, get the services that you need at that point as well. But I think, I'm definitely a proponent of, preventing the fire instead of putting it out. So I think that if we can get ahead of some of those things, just have that space to where, okay, you have a person that is licensed and able to provide those services to you already in the mix. You have a rapport with that person. It doesn't have to be every day you have to talk to them. It doesn't have to be every week. It can start out every other week. It can start once a month. It could, it can ebb and flow. You can see them weekly at first, and then things get a little better. You can go monthly, every few months, more maintenance. Like, it just depends on what you have going on. So I think it's definitely relative for every person, for sure.
Sounds great. So in talking about the partnership between faith and counseling, as a pastor, what would be the most effective way if I'm looking to make, let's say, a handoff? I've been counseling or trying to have conversations with someone. I recognize that there may be a need for them to talk with someone who is certified or licensed, who has the ability to address things beyond my particular skill set or abilities. What should that handoff look like? Is it simply a reference to a particular person as the pastor? Do I need to consider the possibility of being a part of the conversation initially? And then, if so, kind of from the legal standpoint, what does that look like when we're thinking about privacy and all those different things? What's the most effective way that you all have found to make the handoff from the faith leader, pastor, having the conversations and doing the counseling, to now moving to a place where they're actually talking to a licensed therapist?
From my understanding with that is that, one, I think it's about trust. So if they give consent for you to be a part of it, as far as like connecting them with a therapist, and that kind of handles the legal portion of it, and to the fact that you're not working beyond the scope of your abilities or whatever. So I think just the fact that you have a relationship with them will be the best way to proceed. And I know it mentioned before about doing the research with them instead of just giving it to them, explaining the different places where they can get it, offering their support. Like, I think that's really the best way. And the fact that you, as a pastor, you're creating these spaces to even talk about it, that might, end up making a member more comfortable with giving those suggestions or having their hand off. That's just how I see it.
I agree that you can have the conversation, something to the effect of, we've talked, and most times people will recognize when they do need help, or if you've built that rapport, they'll get comfortable to where they'll say something that will let you know that they're open and they're ready. And so I would think for a lot of pastors, to first of all begin to develop a rapport with therapists that that you feel are good in their craft, so that when that time presents itself, you're not fishing first of all to find a therapist.
Sure.
And so I know not all pastors, but I know some within, the church community have not developed relationships with those in the mental health community. So I would say first, as a pastor, to start there by building that relationship with those in the community. And then, saying, this is someone that I think would be good. You don't have to share anything with that therapist because you don't want to break the trust and the bond that you built with the person. So you could just simply give them a referral.
Yeah, and that's a great point. One of the things that we are seeing, or at least I am seeing, is that a lot of churches are going towards a model of working more closely with licensed therapists. They are either choosing to have them on some type of retainer or maybe have them on staff part-time, and that is kind of the person that they would direct families and individuals to when they need to have those conversations. For a second, let's talk about the possibility of what would it look like, or what could it look like, or what possible damage, let me phrase it that way, could a pastor or faith leader do by trying to go outside the limitations? They may have good intentions. They may seriously or honestly, obviously want to help the people that they're trying to counsel. But is there a point or a possibility where a pastor who does not have the training, and I say pastor, and I'm really saying faith leaders, a faith leader who does not have the training or the experience to be able to counsel from a clinical license perspective, is there a possibility that more harm could be done by continuing conversations going outside of limitations than good?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, it can be.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So look at
I
that.
think that's across the board, whether you're a faith leader or not.
Right.
If you are operating in a space that you're not an expert in or trained in, you will do harm. And even, yeah, it's a stronger possibility. I don't even want to say you may not, but it's a stronger possibility that you will, even to the point where it's not seriously detrimental to the client or to the member. That might kind of reinforce the fact that they don't want therapy or something in that matter. So it will definitely do harm if anyone acts out of their scope.
From a faith perspective, you said what would that look like?
Yeah, what would that
Elder
look
Miller? One of the ways is shaming. When people have a problem or something they're going through, sometimes what those in faith do is question the person's level of Christianity. They're not praying enough, or they're not doing this enough, or they need to do that. And what that does is further shame them in their feelings. It doesn't help them address the problem, but then it also further makes them begin to question their relationship with the Lord, where that may not even be the problem. So one of the ways how that looks is shaming. Another way of how that looks is isolation. You know, you just kind of need to just kind of spend some time to just kind of do your thing, or fast and pray. And there's nothing wrong with fasting and praying, but some situations need more than that. They need therapy, they need help, they may even need medication. And so that may increase the problem. For example, it may increase more hopelessness, more isolation if they're dealing with depression. So that's kind of just two ways that it may, what it could look like.
I'm sorry, Ms. Melissa. I think you can also bring in that veer to the left of hopelessness, isolation, and that can go into more serious things like suicidality and people wanting to end. It can open up a different can of worms when folks don't feel supported and feel shamed, like Ms. Melissa was saying. I think that it can definitely make things a lot worse. So I think that the education piece, like we've been talking about, is super important, especially for the faith leaders, to know that if someone reports these things to you, you need to either connect them with a therapist. If it's level 10 and they're talking about hurting themselves, hurting somebody else, okay, we need to take it to, they need to go to the hospital, they need to be evaluated, whatever that looks like. And I think that making sure that we are transparent about that, as clinicians, as faith-based leaders, as supportive people, because ultimately safety is number one. And so having that conversation with that person to say, okay, no matter what we talk about, which is what as clinicians we all do, no matter what we talk about, we're safe. But if you tell me that you want to hurt yourself, hurt somebody else, abuse, neglect of children, elderly, disabled people, you can tell us that a lot. We have to make it an intervention that's going to be a little more serious, because our goal is to be safe. Fireworks. Okay. Okay. Sorry, y'all. All right. So I think that, I'm sorry, people are doing fireworks again. But anyway, silly. So I just think that being aware what your limitations are as a faith-based leader is important, and the education for that is going to be the first step. So where it's like, ooh, this is out of my scope. It's not, prayer is not going, prayer is helpful, but we're getting into territory where it's a safety issue. That's very different.
Sounds great. So going back to kind of the making references and referring as a faith leader, a member to a particular person or place, I guess there was something that came up with that. It may be more of a good idea to provide a list for people to research and then select their own person, therapist, counselor to go and talk to. I guess talk through how that could be beneficial, but also, are there any possibilities? And I'm thinking kind of for myself, and those of you who have made the comments, please continue to comment on it. If I'm already in a place where I'm leery about talking to someone outside of my pastor or someone within my circle, having to do research and being just given a list of people and having to do my own research, could that be a possible barrier for me to actually select someone and follow through with having a conversation with somebody else? Y'all understanding my question?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it can become overwhelming to actually select a therapist. So my transparency moment is you try on therapists like you try on shoes. If it don't fit, it ain't the right color, to be honest. Then you have to continue to search. Yet it becomes overwhelming, and it becomes to the point like, okay, therapy isn't for me. This proved it. I can't even pick nobody from the list. So I think, again, the best way to really combat that is to have like a better introduction. And then some people are just not in that stage of change to seek out a therapy. A therapist, but the list will still be helpful. It can be overwhelming, but that's really part of the process, especially for people of color who aren't very trusting of any provider or anything like that. So I think that, like, yeah, it does take a couple of tries, and maybe just validating that experience, letting them know, like, hey, I know this is a long list. It can be overwhelming, but I'm here to support you. So
Additional.
I think kind of like.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Okay. I know additionally, one thing that is helpful is having your own list of things that you're interested in or what you're looking for in a clinician. Are you looking for an African American clinician or a Caucasian clinician? Are you looking for a clinician that's also in network with your insurance? Are you looking for a faith-based clinician, because we have faith-based clinicians? Having those categories in mind can help you in narrowing down that search to get like a couple of clinicians that might be a good fit. Also, you can definitely call those providers as well to see, like, this is the issue that I'm experiencing, and then just gathering some information from them, like, and just have a conversation over the phone to see if it's a good fit. Not to plug my employee assistance program, but a lot of employers have an EAP. So definitely look into speak with your employer to see if they have an employee assistance program, because those counseling services are free of charge. That way you're able to try on a couple of providers to see if it's a good fit.
One of the things we haven't talked about, we've always our conversation has been based on adults, but we also will have children and adolescents that may need therapy. And so you may want to look in terms of their experience with working with adolescents and youth, or if it's a family dynamic situation, do they have experience working in family therapy? Sometimes, talk therapy is difficult for anybody. So you may want to consider play therapy for children or art therapy. So there are other, modes, method of therapy to also look into as options.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was brought up was that there are several therapists who will offer some level of a free consultation. So that can be helpful too. I can share in my own experience when I was in search of a therapist. I had a list. I thought I kind of knew what I wanted. So I wanted someone who was African American. I wanted someone who was male. I felt like it would be helpful to have someone who was faith-based, all those different things. And so I went through that list. But the person that I settled on after having a conversation with someone who fit everything on my list actually ended up being someone who was white, who didn't consider themselves to be faith-based, but we had similar interests or commonalities that we were able to build rapport on outside of the faith-based and racial aspect. One being that we were both tied to the military in some type of a way. And so I can say that it is helpful to have your list of things that you are going through, but at least from someone who was on the search at one point and ended up working with someone who does not fit what I had on my initial list, that can be very helpful.
That's a good point. I think that I'm a counselor and I have my own counselor, and my counselor is an older, kind of a hippie-ish white lady. She wears Birkenstocks, handmade jewelry, and she lets me have it in the most therapeutic way possible. She calls me on my stuff if I try to, maneuver, whatever. And I think I've also heard folks, it's about a preference. And like Ms. Valerie talked about, and that we talked about before, it's trial and error. Mm-hmm. And so don't be afraid to meet with a therapist one time and be like, no, that's not for me. we didn't click. I didn't get a good vibe. I felt like, they weren't listening, or the reflections weren't, they were missing the mark, because that happens. Everybody is not for everybody, so that makes sense. Like, have things that you definitely don't have deal breakers on, but also be open to the person that's the exact opposite of you might be the person that's going to help you, get the most that you need to get out of it. That's real.
Okay. And along those same lines, are there any potential issues with going to a therapist who, I guess for the purpose of the group that we have here, may not be someone who is, I guess, a Christian therapist, or have that particular vein as a part of what they're looking to offer? Being that we are Christians, we are believers, this is a conversation that's happening with people who are watching who are part of the church. Is there potentially an issue for going to someone who may offer some level of counseling or perspective, and they're coming from a non-Christian aspect, I guess, in a sense?
I think.
Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Valerie. I was gonna say I think
that it would. No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm trying to mute it. My bad.
No, you're fine. Real quick, I was gonna say that I think as clinicians we're taught to, be able to see all people in a sense, but also be mindful of the things that we have limits on. So if a person is really needing that Christian lens, and for that to be talked about in therapy, and for that to be part of their goals and part of the interventions or homework or whatever it is, if they need that to be part of their process, and the person that they're meeting with is not that, I think that can be harmful. I think that you have to be able to advocate for yourself as a person, and then also whoever's supporting you should be able, I feel like can help you. It's okay if you want a person that is Christian and involves that in their treatment modality. That's okay. I think sometimes people get weird about that. But and also, even if you don't, like, it's not something that is required. So I think that, for me, when folks mention their spirituality, I mean, there's a way in which we can make it more general and say, okay, it sounds like that's important to you. Let's talk about what that can look like as far as your coping skills. If you go to church, if you go to Bible study, if you connect with, your church members, they have groups. There's a way in which we can make that, feasible for you with regard to your treatment. But if a person is looking for something very specific, that's okay too.
Yeah, I was gonna say something along those lines, because I do individual therapy, and one of my clients is a Jehovah's Witness, and so I was very transparent as like I'm not totally familiar, and I did it from a lens of like just curiosity, not for her to fully educate me on her faith or anything like that, just so she can know that I support whatever brings her peace. And if that's something that she wants to talk about, in a way, there's no judgment. It's like a judgment-free zone, and just offering them that space, and then allowing them to make the decision as far as like, well, no, I needed to look more like this, and you're not offering me that, and being able to, give them that option or the ability to find another therapist that aligns with what they believe. But I think as a therapist, we can support our client as long as we know our limits, and also don't make it the responsibility of the client to educate us more about their particular faith. I think that will be our responsibility in a way, but not to the point where we're going past our scope as not being a faith-based therapist. So I just think like learning each other and building that rapport that comes with.
So in talking about not going past your scope and all those things, one thing that came up that I do think is interesting is, let's say as a therapist, you have someone come in and they're wanting to have a conversation, and much of their trauma or their hurt is centered around something that happened within the church. A lot of times in African American churches, it is truly a community in a lot of ways. So you have people who you spend a lot of time with. They tend to have the license or feel they have the license to be able to speak into or talk about all areas of your life. And sometimes, honestly, what happens is people will do or say things that cause issues for people in the name of trying to be a good brother or sister in Christ. And now, as a therapist, you are having to deal with it. I guess my question is, how does a person who is looking for help from trauma that is caused from the church best relate to and have a conversation with a therapist about what they're going through?
Well, I do think part of it is that we do have to acknowledge that there is church hurt,
Sure.
and that church hurt is just as important to a person as hurt between husband and wife, hurt between mother and child, or father and child. So it is as significant to that person as any other relationship would be. And so I think we, as a therapist, we have to acknowledge, where that person is and how deeply they are hurt. We will still use the same skills and techniques that we would use if the relationship was between a husband and a wife. Some things can be reconciled and some things may not be, but how do you help that person heal is the key part. Because the other thing is, whether it's church hurt or relationships, we know that hurt people. So, how do we as a church would be the thing that we begin to stop that? How do we provide comfort to those who have been hurt and yet still be able to have that rapport with them? So I think it's key, first of all, to understand that it does exist, that it is a deep hurt as if it were any other type of relationship. And I think as a church, we have to take our part of where we have minimized people's hurt. And we have to begin to repair that.
Absolutely. So along those lines, is there ever a point where it could be good for, and I'm asking this as a pastor, right? For a faith leader, a pastor to say, I need to find a way to help with, because one of the words I continue to see in our chat is accountability on the part of the church and understanding the church's role in this whole idea of the reality of church hurt, all those things. Is there ever a point where, as a pastor, I could just say, look, everybody, we're going to have a group session and we're going to talk through some of the things that we could be unconsciously doing or not doing that are causing issues or trauma for those who are part of our conversation? And then what could that look like? I mean, and I ask it from the perspective of a pastor, because typically people tend to listen to the direction of their pastors, tend to. But at the same time, is there ever a point where, as a collective, it's important for the church to stop and say, how are we helping or affecting the mental health of those that may be a part of our congregation?
I think that's an excellent thing to have that conversation. I had a conversation at work about prejudices, biases, and privilege. So if and it was related to the work that we do as counselors and mental health providers. So I think if that was something, a group that can be led in that way, to have people start being more aware of their own biases and of their own behaviors that can impact others that they're actually trying to help, and just have that candid conversation and much needed dialogue. As Ms. Melissa was saying, like, it has to be acknowledged, and it also has to be some accountability for that. So if you open the floor for that type of conversation, people may, be a little bit more accountable for their behaviors, whether they're implicit or explicit.
Okay.
From a Christian perspective, we first have to start with repent. We have to acknowledge all of us are guilty of that. We have offended someone at some point. We may not even know it, but we all have to start as Christians from that perspective of, I have offended someone. I need to repent for that. I have hurt someone. And so from a Christian perspective, the group is great. But the first thing everybody has to do is come in with the understanding that we all have done something to offend. You know, even those who are feeling offended may have even offended themselves and may not even know it. So we all have to start at that point.
Absolutely. So again, the preacher in me wants to jump to the whole idea of, the Bible says that if somebody offends you, if you have an issue with somebody, then you're supposed to go to that person. You're supposed to go to them in private, and you're supposed to tell them what your issue is. Then if you all can't work it back, you take somebody else, 2 or 3 people, and you all try to work it through it. If you can't work it out that way, then you're supposed to bring it before the entire church. But the reality is there are some really mean people in churches. And a lot of times people aren't comfortable having those conversations with people who maybe they have an issue with, maybe they need to talk something out. And so in some ways, the conversation can't happen, but also what you were talking about, Melissa, the need or understanding the need for true repentance doesn't happen either. So how would you suggest to someone who's saying, look, and I mean, there's this, Anthony in my church is just a terrible person. He's always saying things that are rude or offensive and all those kind of things. I want to say something to him, but he's just a mean guy. How would you all, or what would you all encourage someone to do in those situations to be able to have what could potentially be a helpful conversation in getting some of that stuff out?
Well, from the church, you have to create an environment, and that doesn't always happen right away. So you have to create an environment of, in this church, we uplift, we have compassion. Are we gonna always agree? No, we aren't, because we're all human. But how are we going to communicate to each other when there is a disagreement? I think that's part of it. We have to begin to create a new environment because for so long we haven't done it. For some people, they've been offended. We know they've been offended. And it's like, okay, well, but no, we have to be intentional as the body of Christ to create an environment, one of support, one of where we are open to discuss. And a lot of times, it takes a lot of time. Well, there'll be some headaches through that. Yes. Building anything, will take some moments where it's tense, but if your intentions are good, and that's a part of that, building that foundation of creating that new environment, of how you're going to be as a body.
Absolutely.
I
go ahead.
think one thing that can be done to create that new body is perhaps have mediators. I know, like in my high school, taking it back, like we had mediators that went through training for conflict resolution. So perhaps having some people that have that passion and that have that experience, who's unbiased, similar to a therapist, but just like an unbiased person that can kind of work to come to some type of resolution between people to have a more cohesive body of Christ.
Absolutely. And one of the things I do see a lot as I'm looking in the comments is the word culture and the need for a culture shift. And I will say that is very true, but also that is not we have a great panel. That is not the job of the therapists or the counselors who are on the panel to change that. A lot of that, or much of that, starts with the leadership of the local church, not just the pastor, but those who are helping with the spiritual formation and leadership of the church. Because to the point that Sharice made, there are going to be all kinds of people and personalities within the body of the church. Sometimes our best ability to be able to deal with those different personalities is understanding how to communicate with those different personalities and share the things that we need to share that are on our mind. I do want to kind of shift gears just a little bit to go back to kind of talking through some of the recent or the current events that are happening. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago as a part of this group with the things that are going on that have happened with George Floyd, the situation that happened in Atlanta, and other things like that that have happened to people of color for a number of years, and talked about how even if not being directly involved, even if you aren't a direct relative of one of the people who have lost their lives or been a victim of some level of systematic injustice that has been played out in the media, are there potentials for some level of PTSD or some level of kind of mental, and I'm hesitant to kind of say mental illness, or some, I guess, ramifications for those of us who are simply just seeing this through social media, seeing this through the news, and even now as we await what are going to be the next things that happen, whether they're convictions or not convictions or whatever, are there potentials for people who are in some ways disconnected physically to be emotionally connected and have some level of PTSD or some other mental issues because of that?
Absolutely. Vicarious trauma.
Mhm.
Vicarious trauma is a trauma response that you experience that may not have been your specific experience. And I think the shared trauma that we have as Black people is, there's just no way that you couldn't, like when we see George Floyd, we see Breonna Taylor, we see Ahmaud Arbery, we see all of these Black people being, unjustly killed, murdered by people that are hired to protect us. It's that innate sort of empathy. It's just like, oh, that could be me. They look like me, that could be me. It could be my brother, my sister, my cousin, my child, my spouse, my parent. It could be any of us. And so the fact that we see ourselves in all of those incidences, because it could be us or it has been us. So vicarious trauma is real. And I think that I think it's important to acknowledge that and validate that for people, that there's going to be times that you feel these things, even though it's not directly related, quote unquote, to you. It's not, it wasn't your cousin. It wasn't, it wasn't like a immediate sort of connection. But because, Black people as a whole, just generationally, we have that shared trauma. And it repeats, like Miss Melissa said earlier, it repeats. Miss Melissa talked about, reliving some of those things that we felt during, Rodney King. And so folks, if we think about, was it Kent State, that, like, all those things that we've had to experience. And then I think the flip side of that is we also can become desensitized to some of it because we hear it so much, because we it's just like, oh, another one. Oh, not the one in Atlanta, the one in Dallas, not the one in Dallas, the one in Houston, not the one in Houston, the one in Miami, and so that's part of it as well. And so, we have those kind of ways that it intersects. And so I think vicarious trauma is a real thing. And to acknowledge that and provide those resources is also very helpful.
I think the fact that if any of us have been watching just in the media, how we've heard more people in society are learning the fact that we as African Americans have the talk. And so the fact that that still is going on generation to generation is proof that, yes, there can be some anxiety from things that are going on because it's repetitive, vicarious, as she was saying.
So if we can talk more about the term, I think you said vicarious trauma. Is that, so would that manifest itself or look like, direct trauma, or are there other more subtle aspects of it that may not be as recognizable to the person who may be experiencing it?
It can look very similar. Yeah, it can. I don't know if folks, well, of course, remember 9/11, but people were literally experiencing trauma responses to 9/11 who were nowhere near there, seeing it, witnessing it on TV. If you think about any sort of traumatic thing that we watch over and over again or see more than once, or anything that affects us in that way, it absolutely can look like PTSD. It can, but it can also be more subtle. It can be, just that kind of feeling in the pit of your stomach, that kind of always that kind of hypervigilance of kind of just looking over your shoulder and like, dang, they just shot somebody in this place. I got to be careful. So I work for the court system, and so I definitely, as a Black person, a Black woman, I see the cops all the time. The police it's downtown. I work next to the courthouse. The jail's across the street. And so I definitely remember being late for a meeting, like by a couple minutes, and I was going to jaywalk. And I definitely remember a police officer's right next to me. I'm like, this person could literally shoot me in the back in broad daylight and get away with it. I'm just going to stay right here. I'll be a couple minutes late. I don't want to have to explain that to anybody, but just that internal dialogue, like that's real. It can look like a few things for sure.
If anybody's been watching the news lately, if you've seen that clip of the little girl who sees the police officer, it's a female police officer, and she panics because she's afraid that the police officer is going to hurt her. She just starts crying. That's what vicarious trauma looks like, though she was not related to any of those that we've lost to police brutality here lately, but because it's been in front of her eyes, as soon as she saw that policewoman, that's the first thing that she thought of. The same thing can happen even for those who've experienced like Hurricane Katrina. So vicarious trauma is not just by seeing somebody get killed, it could be through natural disasters as well. So
Okay.
And then also, even with therapists, we experience our own vicarious trauma from like holding that for our clients. And we talk a lot about how that makes us feel, compassion fatigue, and different things like that. So vicarious trauma definitely goes across all boards in every way, even to the professionals that help.
Absolutely. So, and I'm sure that the whole idea of what you just shared, Valerie, of compassion fatigue could, in some ways, be similar or something similar that church leaders, youth leaders, or whomever are experiencing as they're trying to talk through and help make sense for people in the youth group or people in the church as they're dealing with some of these things as well. So, in talking about that, the whole idea of compassion fatigue, what can someone who, again, is not a licensed counselor, I'm a youth pastor, I'm a men's group leader or whatever, do to help with dealing with their own compassion fatigue, if you would?
Self-care. That's like in all capital letters.
Okay.
That's the biggest component to it. Whatever your self-care is, that's one of the best ways to kind of handle passion. No, not even kind of handle it. That is the best way to handle compassion fatigue. Whatever is in your toolbox for self-care, that's the best way to combat it.
You really have to start finding tools to utilize when you're and what Valerie said, building your toolbox of coping skills. Self-disclosure, I have found that gardening is something that's helpful for me, right? But it's trial and error. Not everything is going to work for you, just like not every therapist is going to work. But start to build that toolbox of coping skills. Additionally, what you may do, the coping skill that you use today may not be the helpful coping skill tomorrow. So really start to find those coping skills and implement that into your life.
Also unplug. I think a lot of times you know, as Christians, you know, we just keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And there are times that we do need to unplug, to be able to relax and rejuvenate and then plug back in again. I'm not saying, you know, so if you're in a ministry, it's okay if you need to take a break. You know, to take a break, to be able to be filled again, and then you can go back. And so that's the other thing too. There are times that you just have to unplug, take care of self, and then recharge.
Some things that are like you can easily access them is progressive muscle relaxation, or visualization techniques. You can definitely go on YouTube and type those in to give some guided meditation. That way you can, that's a good way of just taking your mind away from what's going on in that moment.
One thing I know that they found that works with a lot of seniors is actually going back to something that we all did as kids, which is coloring. You will see a lot of, if you go in a lot of bookstores now, you'll see adult coloring books because that is a way of relaxation. And so it may sound silly to some, but it is helpful to those. Reading is good. Even exercise, because it does help with the chemistry in the brain. So walking and things like that are also good. Getting adequate sleep.
I think that also, if it gets to the place where, like we talked about before, where it's impeding your day to day, get your own counselor. I think that, like, as clinicians, we are taught to, well, in my program, shout out to Kyla because she was in my master's program. You know, they drilled in us to have your own counselor. You're going to hear a lot of stuff. You're going to carry a lot of things with you. It's going to be very hard to manage day to day, especially starting out, until you figure out how to, you know, compartmentalize it in a healthy way. And self-care is one, but having your own counselor is also a good one. And if, you know, practice what you preach. If you're going to be advocating for someone else to have a counselor, you know, I don't know if you go by Reverend Kennebrew, but Reverend Daniel, Pastor, you know, you know, having your own counselor, having that story to tell. Like, I have my own counselor. So, like, normalizing it and making it so, okay, I had a struggle. I was going through something. This person, licensed professional, helped me get through that. It might work for you.
Okay. And it definitely, those are great thoughts. And again, in the comments, there are a lot of wonderful suggestions that are coming out of there. It definitely sounds like the underlying theme is there needs to be a level of balance. There needs to be a level of having an outlet, if you will, that you can utilize for those self-care options that you need. I do want to ask one more question, and this is more so personal and selfish, but is there a potential for social media and all the things that we see on social media where there are, I'm trying to use the most churchy phrase that I can use, Christian phrase, just stupid people on social media? And I'm one of the people where I feel the need sometimes to address ignorance. I don't know why. And so and I get that there's the idea of, oh, you can just ignore it and move on. But sometimes I just feel compelled to be like, you know what? You just said something really dumb, so I got a little time today and we're gonna have the conversation.
It's all about educating people.
Oh,
it is about educating people, because I understand that completely.
Okay.
People lack of knowledge, especially for mental health and how it really affects us. So I keep that up and down my timeline. I make those comments. The comment of how trauma and different things affect our children, how it's affecting men, how Black men are ignored as far as their mental health are concerned. So yes, like, even if it's just a seed drop, like, it's not good to ignore their ignorance, because they will pass that on to somebody else who's struggling and they won't seek the help they need. So for me and myself, I drop the knowledge all the time. I connect people, whether it's a website, a definition, a video. So I don't I think it's important for us to really address the ignorance and don't continue to let people be blind to something that's so serious for our community and others. But now, don't ignore the ignorance at all, if at all possible.
I think self-care is important, though. I think that you have to have boundaries with yourself. I think, some folks catch me in a good day and like, Pastor Kennebrew said I had time. Maybe I have to take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Like if you have time and you're in a position, in a place, a mental space to provide education and not get riled up when people respond to that education with more ignorance, because they will, do what you need to do. If you feel like, it's always, everything has to have a purpose, and what your intention is. If your intention is to educate and be done with it. If your intention is to go in on folks, you're going to be doing that all day. So just take care of yourself, have boundaries with yourself. Don't read the comments, ignore people if you can. If you have time, then do that. But just be mindful of how you absorb that energy as well. Just be mindful.
So you're saying as long as I practice my self-care, I can create time to address some of the ignorance. I'm trying to justify some of my.
You can do what you want, just
Yeah, I agree though. I agree. Practice your self-care and find that balance.
But be careful, because once you get into that rabbit hole,
yeah, it's possible.
The rabbit hole, and you'll definitely get exhausted from doing all of that.
Yeah, I agree. That has happened to me before, definitely. So we talked about a lot tonight, and I do appreciate it. But one of the things that I want to at least kind of, as we prepare to wind down for tonight, especially from the church perspective, there was a lot of robust conversation about the need to talk through church hurt, but also just recognizing and acknowledging hurt in general. What are some good next steps that, as those of us who are leaders on this call, who lead faith organizations, churches, and church members and church leaders, that we can do immediately to start talking through or preparing ourselves to deal with the needs that are right there in our congregations? What can we begin to do starting today to put ourselves in a better position as a community of believers, but also just as people in general, to move forward?
Well, one of the things I would suggest is developing a health and wellness ministry. You may have members in your congregation who have expertise in both of those areas, physical health and mental health, because in a lot of cases, those issues can overlap. So I think developing a health and wellness ministry that will incorporate mental health to begin to address those issues. Also, becoming involved in taking some online trainings on understanding mental health, because that's the other key part too. You have to understand before you can help. So I think those are two things that can be done, and always partnership. You don't have to go at it alone. If you know of an organization that ties into the things that you want to address from a mental health perspective, begin to build that relationship with them. So partner with organizations that are out there as well.
I would say the resource list is a good place to start. I think, like Miss Melissa was saying, that collaboration piece is super important. And so, beginning to have 4 or 5 counselors that or psychologists or however, that are willing to, connect with the folks that you refer to them, I think is something that can be done fairly quickly. But I think the idea of a health and wellness ministry sounds really great because that's already integrating the faith part and the mental health part. It's normalizing it. It's saying, we know this is an issue. Let's talk about it. And this is a priority for us. And once folks understand that the church as a whole feels like it's a priority, folks will be more apt to be involved, I think.
And for our denomination, for those who may have smaller churches, then you may want to form, a few churches together to build that health and wellness ministry. So within your district or your diocese, that's another thing to do.
Absolutely. And that collaboration is always great, just because churches may be smaller in size and sometimes maybe limited in resources. Working together, pulling those resources together can be helpful in a lot of ways. So Amy Henley is posting and going back and reposting all of the website resources that have been mentioned tonight as a part of the conversation. So if you want to make recommendations to your church leaders, those are some good places to start. So check those out and share those. So panel, I do thank you. I do have one more question that I wanted to make sure that I ask. I just saw it. I would have asked it earlier. And I want us to take some time to kind of talk through this, especially being in the church, being in the African-American church. Obviously, sometimes when there are tragedies that happen, we give the good church answer, the Christian answer as well. Trust God. God knows best, all those kind of things. But the question specifically is, how does one effectively deal with the tragic loss of a loved one? In particular, being able to move forward and live life without that loved one being there anymore.
Well, first of all, there's stages of grief. And people can go through different stages at different times. Some people will start at the denial stage. Some people will be at the acceptance stage. So there's never this thing of, oh, it's done and it's over. They're just stages of grief. And after you go through that stage, then you begin to cope. That does not mean that you may not still experience those stages. So another part that but understand that people that is grief long term available help
Of an
It may have been me. I don't know. Something just happened, I think, with my internet. Did everybody drop off?
No, still
Mm-mm.
So
Were you ready to wrap it up?
Yes, we are. So again, thank you all for your time tonight. I think we've talked through a bit of information. Obviously, we knew and we understood that we weren't going to be able to talk through everything that people wanted to talk about in this conversation. So our hope and our goal is to have some level of a follow-up where we take into consideration the things that have been shared tonight, the things that have been talked through, and we begin to have a more robust conversation. We definitely want to, on the next panel, have more of our church leadership or a couple of representatives from our church leadership on the panel to be able to offer that perspective. But again, to the ladies who were sharing tonight, to Kyla, Melissa, to Raquel and to Valerie, thank you so much for your willingness to share your insight and your perspective. And also thank you for the robust conversation that has been going on in the comments. I really do appreciate all of you sharing. So we are going to prepare to close out tonight. Keep in mind that in a couple of days, we will do our cleaning up and editing, and we will get this on the Congress YouTube page. It will be available for you to go back and to watch and all those things. But as always, if you have questions, if you have anything that you would like to share, definitely let myself or President Daniel Kennebrew know. Thank you to our President Kennebrew for allowing us the space and the opportunity to have these conversations, and we look forward to doing many more. So I'm going to close with a word of prayer, and then we will hop off. Father, again, we're grateful and thankful for the opportunity we've had tonight to have this much needed conversation. Father, we thank you for the engagement. We thank you for the beginning of understanding that we've been able to experience and have in this conversation. Now, God, we thank you for the opportunity to move forward and take the next steps. We are grateful for the access to resources. We're grateful for the access to people who are able to help us understand how to move forward. Now, God, we pray that you would give us the courage, that you would give us the wherewithal to begin to do what we need to do to deal with our own issues of mental health, but also the issues of those of us that are around us in our church, our faith, and our communities. So, Father, our prayer is that your Spirit would lead us and guide us in all things, but that you would also remind us of the resources that you have placed here on this earth for us to be able to be the people who are at peace and whole as you've called for us to be. So, God, we pray that you would cover us and keep us even as we dismiss ourselves from this call. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Again, thank you all so much. Members of the panel, if you would stay on for just a couple of minutes, it won't be too long. I would really appreciate it. For everyone else, thank you so much. And we look forward to you being on the next call. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.